hear the questions asked or to ask some yourself, you'd be more than welcome to do that. I mention that so that if anything I say triggers a question, you be sure to write it down or at least make a mental note of it and challenge me on it later on as we go by. Well, here we go. We're into the second letter that Paul wrote to the Thessalonians. As far as outside details, all you really need to know is that it was written shortly after the first. It seems to have been written from Corinth. Paul's circumstances have not changed, which would mean it too was written in the early 50s, not the 1950s, the early 50s. And that's 50 A.D., all right? So it's one of the earliest letters written. Perhaps 1st and 2nd Thessalonians are the two earliest parts of the New Testament written. And as this second letter begins, we're reminded of what we saw in the first letter, that is Paul's 5-step plan of making disciples. I don't know if he would have thought of it as a 5-step plan, but we saw throughout the first letter 5 different things he was doing to make disciples of these folks in Thessalonica. Here it is. He was settling them in their faith, working to point them towards God as the author and the finisher of their faith. He was caring for them letting them know that he cared. He was praying for them and letting them know that he was praying. He was being an example of a disciple to them, and he was teaching them how to live a disciple's life. And here as we begin this second letter and just look at the first few verses, we see evidence of the same 5 steps or the same 5 principles in his life. Let's just cover these. Do we see him settling them in their faith? We see that in verses 3 and 4. As again, he thanks God for their enlarged faith. They were growing in faith, they were growing in love, and he thanks God. He's pointing them to the fact that all this is a work that God is doing in them. God was at work to will and to do his good pleasure. So once again, he's pointing to evidences that they are in fact born of God. They are in fact God's children. And as we looked at that step in our study of 1 Thessalonians, we saw several evidences he pointed to, and we see 3 of them tonight. One of the evidences of faith by which you settle a new believer into his faith is faith itself, and he mentions their faith in verse 3. Another evidence is the presence of good works in a person's life, and you can find that in verse 3 as he speaks of the love of each one of you toward one another. That love can't just be a feeling. New Testament love that we're commanded to is not a feeling, it's an action, and so that's the good works, that the fruit that proves we are the genuine tree. You tell a tree by its fruit. One of the other evidences by which you settle someone into his faith is perseverance, and there in verse 4 we find him speaking of their perseverance and their faith or their faithfulness in the midst of all their persecutions. There in verse 4 we see evidence of him caring for them. He speaks freely to them about how he was proudly speaking in all the churches about the Thessalonians. He was down in Achaia now, in what is now Greece, but was still speaking proudly of the Thessalonians up in Macedonia. And he made known to the Thessalonians how proud he was of the Thessalonians to encourage them, step 2, to care for them and let them know he cared. Is he praying for them? Well, we see that in verses 11 and 12. It's implied in verse 3 where he says, we thank God for you, but it's clearly stated in verses 11 and 12. He says, we also pray for you always, and explains to them something of the things he was praying for them. We don't see any clear-cut reference here to being an example. That will come in chapter 3 very clearly. So all 5 steps, or chapter 3, all 5 steps are here in the second letter. But as far as teaching them, the bulk of this first chapter is teaching. Verses 5 to 10, Paul gets busy and teaches them something else that they really need to know in order to become full-grown, mature disciples of Christ. Now what he teaches them tonight, and we'll look at these 6 verses together, verses 5 to 10 in particular, what he teaches them, you see in verse 5. He teaches them on the subject of God's righteous judgment. And the reason that he takes this theme, it's not just an incidental thing, it didn't just come up next in the curriculum. The reason he speaks to them in this letter about God's righteous judgment has to do with what he mentions in verse 4. It has to do with all their persecutions and afflictions which they endure. Now we just need to take a pause for a moment and realize that we just can't possibly comprehend what he had in mind, because we're not a persecuted church, and very few, if any of us, know anyone who does belong to a persecuted segment of the church. I hope you've done some reading of church history, some reading of what's going on in parts of the world today, and then you have a comprehension of the unspeakable persecution that God's people are routinely and regularly called to endure. In this sheltered part of the world where we are so blessed and so protected by God, we don't have much comprehension about that sort of thing. But there's lots of references in history books, and I came across one just this week that gives us a bit of an idea of the kind of things that Paul was talking about when he spoke of their persecutions and the afflictions which they endured. Now that was 50 A.D., thereabouts, in the Roman part of the world in the Roman Empire under the persecution of the Judaizers, the Jewish persecutors. This reference that I just came across this week has to do with a later period in church history, the year 235 A.D., thereabouts, and has to do with the suffering of the Christians who were sent off to the lead mines of Sardinia. But it's all in keeping with the kind of things that the Thessalonians and the Philippians and Christians all through the ages have been called to endure. This is the story of two men, one 63 years old and another 70 years old, who were old, godly men and had lived their lives for Christ, and they were sent by the Romans during a time of persecution off to the lead mines. Here's the kind of persecution that some Christians have endured. They were all, men and women, properly inducted as slave miners. First, the left eye was gouged out with a dagger, and the socket was cauterized with molten iron. The joints of the left foot were burnt, and one nerve at the back of the right knee was sliced. All males under 30 years were castrated. Then, when all had been branded with a number on the forehead, each one was manacled in the slave miner's fashion. First, iron rings were soldered around the ankles and linked together by a 6-inch chain. Then a tight chain was placed around the waist, very tight, for prisoners lost weight rapidly, and the chain had to catch at the hip bones. This chain was attached by a third chain to the ankle chain in such a way that the prisoner could never straighten up again. He had to bend down anyway for 20 out of every 24 hours a day. No locks were used. All chains were soldered permanently. Immediately on being chained and branded, each prisoner was tied to one of the rough obelisks and given 60 strokes of the lash, and then handed a pick and shovel and sent to work in the mine. The system always worked the way it was supposed to work. By that first nightfall, the weaker had died and only the stronger survived. Of each new slave contingent, 2/3 usually made it past the first evening. Henceforward, they neither shaved, washed, cut their hair or finger or toenails, were not supplied with more clothes, got one meal of coarse bread and water per day, worked 4 5-hour shifts a day, had a daily assigned workload, and slept on the ground in their own filth. Prisoners generally lasted a surprising 6 to 14 months, after which they died from arthritis, tuberculosis, heart failure, or other diseases, or exhaustion, or malnutrition, or beatings, or infection of some kind. Some were killed by fellow convicts. Others committed suicide, usually by stuffing their nostrils and throat with earth during the 4 one-hour rest periods allowed. A 70-year-old man who had served the Lord all his life, taken away with a 63-year-old man to die a cruel death in the lead mines of Sardinia. Now that was a little later when the persecution was fiercer, but it gives you some sort of idea of the kind of things that Paul is speaking of, which we might otherwise just gloss over without thinking when he makes mention of all your persecutions and all the afflictions which you endure. Well, speaking about their persecutions and their afflictions, he arrives at the subject of God's righteous judgment. Paul had warned them that they would be persecuted. He warned them that they would suffer. In the first letter, you remember chapter 3, he says in verse 3, so that no man may be disturbed by these afflictions, for you yourselves know that we have been destined for this. For indeed, when we were with you, we kept telling you in advance that we were going to suffer affliction, and so it came to pass, as you know. He made a very careful point while in Thessalonica of warning them that persecutions and afflictions would come. Paul made it a policy to explain that to all who were following the Lord Jesus. We can read, for example, in Acts chapter 14 that as Paul and Barnabas began to tour through the churches that they had established, visiting once again those new believers and the believers that the new believers had won, they went out, it says, strengthening the souls of the disciples and encouraging them to continue in the faith, saying to them, through many tribulations we must enter the kingdom of God. The rule of thumb in those days was you just can't get there. You can't become a man or a woman fully pleasing to God without going through many afflictions. Well, the Thessalonians were mentally prepared for the suffering, but when it began to happen, still they had questions. It was one thing to academically accept, yes, God's children must suffer, but when they began to experience it, when they saw their loved ones carried away, when they saw husbands and wives and children torn apart and sent off to die in various parts of the Roman Empire, they began to wonder. The question they wondered at was this: God is good and God is powerful. More than that, God is infinitely good. God is infinitely powerful. If God is infinitely good and infinitely powerful, how can it be that these things are happening? God has the power to stop it. God has the goodness to hate it. Why does he not stop all of these things? To answer that question, Paul teaches them something about God's righteous judgment. Now, the idea of God's righteous judgment is based on two building blocks of our faith. One is that God is judge. The Bible explains it all the way through. God is the judge. That means that the things that happen in this earth happen as a result of his judgment. Those things that are good happen to us because God is judge. And in his mercy, he judges us kindly and brings favors into our lives. When difficult things happen, again, they happen because God is the judge. That's a basic building block of our faith. Well, it was one thing to agree academically that God was judge, that he was the judge of all the earth and watched over all men and exercised full control over all of them. But when loved ones were being torn and dragged out of the church and sent off to die, the question that would come to mind is, where's the judge now? God is judge? Why is he not judging my enemies? The other basic building block that this subject's built upon is that God is righteous. God is the judge. God is righteous. The idea is that everything that God does is right. God never does wrong. He always does right. The things we see happening in the world are what God is doing in the world, and God never does wrong. He always does right. He's fully in control. He's fully in power. He reigns. And they would ask, then why do we suffer? Is God righteous but absent? Is he righteous but ignorant of what we're going through? Is he righteous but aloof? Paul says, no, he's both righteous and he is the judge. Now that's an established fact from Scripture. If you adhere to the Bible, you've got to live with it and work it out. God is the righteous judge. He judges, and he always judges rightly. I want to give you a brief overview of the entire Old Testament to establish that fact. Here are a number of references, and we can just sort of go through them at a quick pace and see some references to God and his righteous judgment. The first one's interesting. It comes from the life of Abraham in Genesis chapter 18. In Genesis chapter 18, verse 25, we read, you can let me read it too if you want, and so not be bothered turning to it. We read of Abraham bargaining with God to spare Sodom and Gomorrah, a city given up to well-known, infamous ungodliness. And he says to God, will you not spare the city if I can find so many righteous men? And he barters with God and moves it down, so to speak. God allows him to intercede. His statement in Genesis 18:25 fits in with our theme. God says, Abraham says to God, far be it from you to do what is not right. Shall not the judge of all the earth do what is right? That's the question. Shall the judge of the earth not do what is right? And the obvious answer is no. He's righteous. He will always do what is right. He shall never be guilty of doing anything less than what is fully right. That's in the year 2000 A.D., or 2000 B.C. when that was stated by Abraham, living 2,000 years before the birth of Christ. We move ahead into Deuteronomy, and we're looking more like 1200 B.C., and we see the Song of Moses in Deuteronomy chapter 32. Verse 4 praises God. It says, the rock. His work is perfect, and all his ways are just. A God of faithfulness, a God without injustice, righteous and upright is he. The point of the statement is that God has never done anything wrong. No one's ever been wronged by God. The things that have come into a believer's life especially are always the right things. God never does anyone any wrong. That's 1200 B.C. or so. We move ahead into the Psalms, and we're looking at about 1000 B.C., the days of David. And Psalm 119, that long psalm which praises God for his word in 174 different ways or so, says in verse 137, righteous are you, O Lord, right are you, and upright are your judgments. The judgments with which you judge, the things that you do, that you judge to be right, are always right. You never do anything but that which is right. And we move ahead. To go chronologically, we move ahead to Hosea and find Hosea, the first Old Testament prophet to speak prophecy during the reign of Uzziah, somewhere around 800 or so, 800 or 700 B.C. He ends his prophecy. The first Old Testament prophet to speak prophecy ends his prophecy, chapter 14, verse 9, this way. Whoever is wise, let him understand these things. Whoever is discerning, let him know these things. The ways of the Lord are right. The ways of the Lord are right. The things that he do, the things that he does, are always right. And then a couple of hundred years later, Ezekiel, chapter 18, verse 25, verse 29. You say, the way of the Lord is not right. Hear now, O house of Israel. God says, is my way not right? Is it not your ways that are not right? Verse 29, the house of Israel says, the way of the Lord is not right. Are my ways not right, O house of Israel? Is it not your ways that are not right? Israel at this point had been carried away into captivity. They were living in Babylon when they wanted to live in the Holy Land. They had been carted away. Their nation had been ravaged and devastated and destroyed. They were suffering horribly down in Babylon as slaves of a pagan empire. And they said, the Lord's ways are not right. What the Lord allows to happen is not the right thing. And God says, is it not your ways that are not right? The Lord does what is right. The judge of all the earth shall always do that which is right. There is a challenge involved here. It's a challenge of seeing things from God's perspective. And we're told in the New Testament that we cannot see things in God's perspective without something of God's work in our lives. So we find, for example, in Romans 12:2, the statement, don't be conformed to the world. Because through conformity to the world, you'll think wrongly about God and begin to think that what he does is not right. Do not be conformed to the world, it says, but rather be transformed by the renewing of your mind. What happens when a person is transformed? What happens when his mind is renewed? He is able to prove that which is the good and acceptable and perfect will of God. So what God does, we begin to see, is good and acceptable and right. Good and acceptable and perfect. God does no harm. God does no wrong to his people. The men carried away into the Sardinian lead mines were being dealt rightly with by God. It's this transformation, this renewing of our mind that allows us to come to the point that the psalmist came to in Psalm 119, verse 75, when he was able to say, through God's work in his life, through God's enlightenment, he was able to say, I know, O Lord, that thy judgments are righteous, and that in your faithfulness you have afflicted me. In your faithfulness you have afflicted me. When we are afflicted in God's faithfulness to us, because he always does that which is right. It takes some getting used to. I mean, it doesn't take any getting used to here. We can all nod our heads and say, that's right, God's right. But when tragedy strikes, when some horrible devastation sweeps into your life and all your life comes apart, that's when it takes the transformation that occurs by the renewing of your mind before you can say, I know, O Lord, that your judgments are right, and that in faithfulness, only by your faithfulness, you afflict me. Now, this is a very important New Testament theme, and Paul was teaching it here. And another place where it's taught in the New Testament gives it to us in some more detail. Let's look at the Hebrews chapter 12, verses 6 to 11. Because here we find the writer to the Hebrews elaborating upon the same theme. Hebrews chapter 12 is that classic chapter on discipline. It was written to people who knew something of the suffering that we are speaking of. If you've got chapter 12 open, it might be on the right side of your page, and over on the left side of your page you see the tail end of chapter 10. If you do so, look at chapter 10, verse 32. He says to these people, remember the former days when, after being enlightened, you endured a great conflict of sufferings, partly by being made a public spectacle through reproaches and tribulations, and partly by becoming sharers with those who were so treated. You showed sympathy to the prisoners, accepted joyfully the seizure of your property, knowing that you have for yourselves a better possession and an abiding one. He's speaking here to people not like us, detached from the whole realm of great suffering. He speaks to people who knew what it was to be afflicted. And in chapter 12, he begins his explanation of all of this in verse 6 and says, quoting the Old Testament, those whom the Lord loves, he disciplines. God scourges, God whips every son whom he receives. It is for discipline that you endure. It's not because God is out of control. It's not because God does not see what's happening. It's for the sake of your discipline that you must endure these things. God is dealing with you as with sons. For what son is there whom his father does not discipline? But if you are without discipline, of which all have become partakers, then you're illegitimate children, you're not true sons. Furthermore, we had earthly fathers to discipline us, and we respected them. Shall we not much rather be subject to the Father of our spirits and live? For they disciplined us for a short time, as seemed best to them. But he disciplines us for our good. Look at this. That we may share his holiness. All discipline for the moment seems not to be joyful, but sorrowful. Yet to those who have been trained by it, afterward it yields the peaceful fruit of righteousness. The point here, you see, is that we must go through this experience, this discipline. We must go through some affliction because God has higher things for us than can be attained through the living of a normal life. God's aspirations for us, verse 10, are that we someday share his holiness. And that is such a spectacular ambition for us. It's so out of the ordinary that it's going to take a very out of the ordinary experience to qualify us for it. Now here in our text tonight, we see the same thing being spoken of. In 2 Thessalonians chapter 1, he speaks in verse 4 of all the persecutions and the afflictions which they endure. And he says this is not bad luck. This is not God losing control. This is not someone superimposing upon God's will his own will. This is God's righteous judgment, so that you may be considered worthy of the kingdom of God. It is for the kingdom of God which indeed you are suffering. And in verse 11, he says, this is what we're praying always for you, that our God may count you worthy of your calling. To be worthy of this calling, to share in the holiness of God, takes some very special attention. And God is willing in his love to give us his attention. Whether it's pleasant or not for the time being, it will be pleasant when it's all over. This is best illustrated perhaps by the old turtle and the baby illustration. You know the old turtle and the baby illustration? You don't, eh? It's because I just made it up. All right. When I was a young boy, I had turtles, 4 little suckers in an aquarium. I love those turtles, and we got along fine. You know why? Because I had very low aspirations for those turtles. I only expected 3 things from them. I wanted them to lie under a light bulb and sun themselves. I thought that'd be great if, coming into my room, I found them under the light bulb. I wanted them to swim through the water and look through the glass with their little turtle eyes at me at various times in the day. And I wanted them to eat little worms that I would dig for them out of the garden and throw into their tank. Well, they were up to that. Lying under a light bulb, swimming through the water, gobbling up little worms is exactly what they were able to do. They were up to it. They did what I expected, and so I never pressured them to change. They were all that I ever wanted a turtle to be. And as long as they lived their little turtle lives, we got along fine. And I never bothered them. I supplied them with worms and a light bulb, and that was that. I don't have turtles anymore. Now I have children. And my expectations are higher. And so I discipline my children in ways I never would think to discipline my turtles. And I will discipline my children much more as their potential increases. As their potential grows greater, I will discipline them more. I will pressure them. I will bother them. I will not allow them to be what they want to be if it's not as much as they could be. When my son was 1 year old, he was free to lie on the kitchen floor and drink from a bottle. That was no problem. I'd come home from work, and there he was, vegged out on the floor, sucking it back, and there was no problem at all. I let him lie there. Now he's 2 years old. He sits on the kitchen floor, and he drinks from a cup. When he's 16, I'm going to want him up off the floor. If I come home from work someday, and he's 16 years old, and I find him lying on the kitchen floor with a bottle in his hand, I'm going to be bugged, because his potential has exceeded what it was 15 years ago. And so I'll discipline him. But I won't discipline him because I'm bugged. At least if I'm a good father, I won't discipline him because I'm bugged. I'll discipline him because I love him and because I have his good in mind. What good do I have in mind? I want him to share my manhood. I want him to learn the things my father taught me about being a man. And being a man does not involve at any time lying on the kitchen floor with a bottle in your hand. So I don't allow him to go on like that. Well, God has the very same thing in mind for us. He wants us to share his holiness. It would be too strong to say he wants us to share his godhood, as I want my son to share my manhood, but he wants us to share his holiness, so he doesn't leave us alone. He doesn't allow us to live the comfortable life of a turtle lying under a light bulb or swimming through the water gobbling worms. He puts pressure on us. In fact, everything that happens to us is pressure he puts upon us because he wants us to share his holiness. This is what Paul is getting at in Romans 8. He speaks to the Romans who are greatly afflicted. He says, I consider that the sufferings of this present time are not worthy to be compared with the glory that is to be revealed to us. And in keeping with that, he says all things work together for good, and then explains in Romans 8:29 that God has predestined us to be conformed to the image of his Son. He wants us to share in the holiness, in the glory of his Son. And so he has prearranged our lives and brought into our lives and will continue to bring into our lives things, some pleasant and some unpleasant, which will bring us into conformity to Christ. What will happen to my son if I don't discipline him? Well, he'll never grow up. One way or the other, he'll never grow up. He might never grow up in the inward sense, in the metaphorical sense. He'll just always be a little kid. And there are men who are old enough to be men and have been old enough to be men for many years, but they're still kids because they weren't disciplined. They weren't trained up. He'll never grow up inwardly if I do not discipline him, if I do not express my love to him in this way. In fact, more literally, he may never grow up. He may never grow up at all. You know, in the Proverbs, chapter 23, it says, do not withhold discipline from your son. If you beat him with a rod, he will not die. That's not a joke. It's not saying go ahead and spank him, it won't kill him. It's saying if you beat him with a rod, he will not die. Beat him, discipline him, and deliver his soul from hell. deliver his soul from hell by disciplining him, by spanking him, by correcting him, by expecting, demanding things of him. Remember in 1 Kings chapter 1, a man named David had a son named Adonijah. You don't need to turn to it. It'll be over in a minute. It says there in chapter 1, verse 6 about Adonijah, his father never pained him at any time by ever asking, why'd you do that? He was a boy, he grew up never being held accountable for his actions. And what happened? Well, you can read the story in 1 Kings chapter 1. Not a nice story at all. I remember something else about being a boy. I was in grade 5, and I can remember very clearly my teacher. It was the first male teacher I ever had, and I didn't like it at all. I remember one time I was grade 5, and I was just sitting there at my desk, and he said, I can remember really clearly, now class, reach into your desks, pull out your notebooks, we're going to do long division. And I could have cried. I could have cried because I just hated the thought of having to spend the next half hour doing long division, 4 and 32, 8, carry the 4, carry the 4. What I wanted to do was throw my pencil down and say, no, 100 times no, I refuse to do long division. But what I did was reach into my desk and pull up my notebook and do long division for at least half an hour. Learning long division was of some value, although now I own 3 or 4 calculators and I don't need to know long division. But learning to do what I had to do was of great value. And if a child does not learn that, well, what hope is there for him? The whole point of education, more than anything else, I think, is learning responsibility and learning to work on your own and learning independence and learning to do what you must do because you must do it. That's the value. And that's the kind of thing that God has in mind for us. And so sometimes he makes the going tough, because if it's never tough, we'll never learn how to get going when the going gets tough. In God's perfect righteousness, that's what Paul is saying, in his perfect righteousness, he rightly calls us to persevere through persecutions and afflictions. Now we need to notice something here. As I've told you, the old turtle and the baby illustration, which no one will probably ever tell you again the rest of your life, or my grade 5 arithmetic illustration, we've been talking here, please notice, about 2 different types of discipline. And both types apply to our argument when we speak about God righteously judging us, righteously bringing into our lives on account of his right judgment the things that should happen. Some discipline comes to us because we disobey. Because we're found lying at 16 years of age on the kitchen floor with a bottle in our hand, we disobey. That's against the house rules, and so we are disciplined. Some discipline comes to us. Some discipline comes from God because we disobey. But please notice that some discipline comes because we obey. What happens if you faithfully do your grade 5 long division all year long? You pass grade 5. What is the reward of passing grade 5? Grade 6. And in grade 6 you do more long division and more difficult long division. And sometimes God brings discipline into our lives because we're not obeying him. But sometimes he brings discipline and hardship into our lives because we are obeying him. We've been promoted to the next grade where it gets a little bit tougher, where there's more to persevere through, and so more holiness to gain. It would be wrong then for a Christian every time something goes wrong for him to instantly conclude, I must have done something wrong. And this can cause all sorts of psychological difficulties, all sorts of depression and introspection. It's not at all the case that the going gets difficult simply because you disobeyed. Sometimes, yes, God chastens us. God spanks us as a father would spank his son. But sometimes the going gets tough because we've been promoted to a new grade. And so we're able to take on new challenges, and there's grace to help in time of need. Well, that's the first thing Paul is saying here. This, verse 5, this persecution and affliction which you endure is a plain indication of God's righteous judgment, so that you may be considered worthy of the kingdom of God. Some of the Thessalonians were doing very well, and so they were persecuted and afflicted to raise them up to a new level of spiritual manhood or womanhood, a new level of spiritual maturity. Others were not doing so well. We read about them in the first chapter, the first book, the unruly they're called. We'll read more about them in chapter 3 of this letter. They were not doing so well. And so the God the Father was disciplining them, spanking them, correcting them, just because they weren't doing so well. That's the first thing that Paul is saying here. And having accepted all of this, as the Thessalonians no doubt would have, he's reminding them here of things he's taught them before, I think. Having accepted this, they come smack dab up to another problem, a whole new problem that we really ought to look at tonight before we go on. Where it may seem unright and unjust for God to discipline us is not the fact of the discipline, but the means of the discipline. Sometimes we can accept, yes, I ought to be disciplined, I ought to go through some affliction because God is raising me up so that I can share in his holiness. That's no problem. But it's how the affliction and how the persecution comes into my life that I have the question about. There is where God seems to be unright and unjust. And what I'm talking about is the method in which at times he allows us to be abused. We are disciplined by being abused by outsiders who are motivated by hatred and wickedness. For example, the slavers in the Sardinian lead mines. I could have read on in that chapter. Horrible men who didn't speak any language known to anyone. They were mercenaries who came down from the wild parts of the world known then, and they just enjoyed being cruel to people, so they took a living in the lead mines where they could abuse the prisoners. Now there, God was disciplining his loved ones, this 70-year-old man, this 63-year-old man. He was disciplining them at the hands of some very wicked men who were motivated by their own hatred and wickedness. Now how can God seem just in that? There's no doubt about it. God does use ungodly men to punish his people when they need punishing, or just to discipline them in that positive sense when they're worthy and ready to be disciplined. I think in the Old Testament of the king of Assyria. The Assyrian Empire was a horribly wicked place. There was just no godliness to be found, no conscience, no uprightness. It was just a terrible, terrible, ungodly empire, and the king stood at the top of all of it. And in Isaiah, God refers to the king of Assyria as the rod of my anger, the staff in whose hand is my indignation. The king of Assyria was doing his best to ruin God's people, and God called him the rod of my anger. He called him my hickory switch, my wooden spoon, if wooden spoons are also things used to spank children in your house. You're getting all sorts of horrible ideas about me as a parent. Never mind, that's just an illustration. The king of Assyria was called the rod of my anger, the staff in whose hand is my indignation. And Paul also addresses this question. What do you say about the fact that the righteous judge righteously judges and disciplines us by allowing ungodly people to afflict us in these horrible ways, or perhaps in our lives in more subtle and less flagrant ways? Well, what you say comes in verse 6. What Paul says to this comes in verse 6. He says, God will repay. You see that? Verse 6, after all, it is only just, or only right. The words are associated. It is only just, it's only right for God to repay. Now, he repays in two ways. First of all, it speaks of him repaying those... No, it doesn't. Let me do it in reverse order. It speaks, second of all, of God repaying those of you who are afflicted. And he repays you with relief. We'll look at that a bit in a minute. But we're exploring the first one. First, God will repay those who afflict you with affliction. We read in verse 6. And with retribution in verse 8, and with eternal destruction in verse 9. God will repay those who are afflicted, that's us, with relief, whatever that is. We'll look at it in a minute. And God will repay those who afflict you with affliction, with retribution, with eternal destruction. Well, that takes care of that for the moment, although it raises another question. I'll let you see if you can think of it yourself. God will repay those who punish us, those who abuse us, those who misuse us. All the slavers, those horrible pagans working in the slave mines and torturing the Christians. God repays them with affliction of their own, with retribution, and with eternal destruction. Our challenge is to really understand that, to really believe it. If we really believed it, it would change our attitude towards those who afflict us. If we really believed it, we'd no longer have problems wanting to work out our own revenge. We would understand well the words of Jesus in Luke chapter 6, where he says, bless those who curse you, pray for those who despitefully use you, do good to them who hate you, pray for them who persecute you. That's not just a call to a high degree of piety. The Lord Jesus knows the jeopardy those who punish us, who abuse us, are putting themselves in. He says, if you had any idea of what will happen to those who hurt you, he says it would be better if a millstone were hung around their neck and they were plunged into the deepest part of the sea. If you could only understand what would happen to them, if you only knew something of affliction and the retribution and the eternal destruction awaiting those who dare touch any of God's little ones, you'd pray for them, you'd bless them, you'd do good to them, you'd ask God to be merciful to them. You would forgive them and ask God to forgive them. Our problem is that we don't really do a very good job of believing that. We don't look at outsiders, those who do not obey the gospel of God, those who do not know God, those who afflict us. We don't look at those people as people subject soon to God's affliction and retribution and to eternal destruction. If we did, our attitude towards them would be, I think, very different. Well, there's another problem here, and I think we can look at it as well. We've got the idea that God, to raise us up so that we can share in His holiness, allows us to go through difficulties, and sometimes at the hands of ungodly men. So Christians are regularly abused and afflicted by outsiders over whom they have no control politically or morally. They cannot get back at these people. These people have power over them and afflict them and tromp them down. And that is God's allowing us, with God's permission. God is training us through all of that. We know that God will punish them in turn. And now here's the question. If God uses outsiders to discipline us, for example, the king of Assyria, He calls him the rod of my anger. If God uses those outsiders for our good, and in fact they're doing something which God wants to be done to us, then how can God turn around and punish them for doing it? They're fulfilling the will of God. How could He then turn to them and punish them for doing something which was necessary for the will of God to be fulfilled? Doing something He intended them to do to us. Well, this comes out in 2 Thessalonians. In verse 5, he talks about God's righteous judgment for us, and God repaying with affliction those who afflict you. But you see, God's righteous judgment in verse 5 is worked in our lives by the affliction of those that God will repay with affliction. So how can God do that? Well, if you insist on an answer, you find it in Isaiah chapter 10. Maybe some of you haven't thought through this to this point, but sooner or later you will. Let's look at Isaiah chapter 10 together. How can God hold responsible those who, in their wickedness, are working for our long-term benefit? And the king of Assyria is the perfect illustration, because the king of Assyria is used in Isaiah chapter 10 to explain what God does. Now, this is really pretty interesting stuff. You may need to think about this for a while to get it. Let's see if we can cover it in just a couple of minutes. Chapter 10, Isaiah chapter 10, verse 5. Woe to Assyria, the rod of my anger, and the staff in whose hand is my indignation. See, they came up against Israel, and they did to express God's anger to Israel. They did to express God's indignation, and yet He says, woe to them. Now, how could He say, woe to them, a curse be upon them, when they were going to do the very thing God called them to do? Verse 6, I send Assyria against a godless nation. That's Judah. And I commission Assyria against the people of my fury, the people with whom I'm furious. It's anthropomorphic language, picturing God as having emotions so that we can understand something of His emotionless wrath. I commission it against the people of my fury to capture booty and to seize plunder and to trample them, God's people, down like mud in the streets. All right, now I'm cursing. I sent them against that nation. I sent them up to punish my people. Verse 7, yet it does not so intend, nor does it plan so in its heart, but rather it is its purpose to destroy and to cut off many nations. For although I sent it, you see, up to trample in the mud these people, its intention was to destroy them and to cut off many nations. And it says in verse 8, are not my princes all kings? And is not Calno like Carchemish, or Hamath like Arpad, or Samaria like Damascus? To which we say, what's that? And what he's saying there is that Assyria looks at God's people and considers them just like every other people. He says, Assyria says, why can't we go to Jerusalem? Why can't we go to Samaria and just tromp them down? Aren't they just like anybody else? Now, verse 10. As my hand has reached to the kingdoms of the idols, here's the king of Assyria speaking, as my hand has reached to the kingdoms of the idols, whose graven images were greater than those of Jerusalem and Samaria, shall I not do to Jerusalem and her images, just as I have done to Samaria and her idols? Assyria makes no difference in its mind between God's people and the rebels against God and the outsiders entirely outside of the covenant. So it will be, verse 12, that when the Lord has completed all His work on Mount Zion and on Jerusalem, that is His work of punishing the Judeans and the Israelites, when He has completed all His work on Mount Zion and on Jerusalem, He will say, now I will punish the fruit of the arrogant heart of the king of Assyria and the pomp of his haughtiness. For he has said, by the power of my hand and by my wisdom I did this. For I have understanding, and I removed the boundaries of the peoples and plundered their treasures. Like a mighty man I brought down their inhabitants. And my hand reached the riches of the peoples like a nest. As one gathers abandoned eggs, I gathered all the earth, and there was not one that flapped its wing or opened its beak or chirped. Here's the question. Is the axe to boast itself over the one who chops with it? Is the saw to exalt itself over the one who wields it? That would be like a club wielding those who lift it, or like a rod lifting him who is not wood. Therefore, the Lord, the God of hosts, will send a wasting disease among his stout warriors, and under his glory a fire will be kindled like a burning flame. See what's going on there? In this particular case at least, you must be careful about extending it. In this particular case at least, where Assyria was sent up specifically to discipline God's people, Assyria was not judged for his actions, but rather judged for his motives. He was not judged for what he did to Judea. It was part of God's plan that he do that to the Judeans. He was judged for his arrogance, for his pomp, for his haughtiness. It gives a whole new significance to that Old Testament statement, God looks on the heart. See, when wicked men come and do wickedness, which is God's will for our lives, to discipline us, God then, it seems, disciplines them or punishes them, not for what they did, because what they did was in some sense ordained by God, but he instead punishes them for their motives, for why they did it all. This is pretty complicated stuff, but you need to think about it because it'll answer a question that you'll come to sooner or later. It's very much like Matthew 26, 24, where Jesus says, the Son of Man must be betrayed, but woe to the one through whom he is betrayed. It had to happen. Someone had to betray Christ, but Judas chose to. And so Judas was judged for his motives. He chose to betray Christ, not his actions. He was not punished for his actions. It had to happen that someone do that. But he volunteered to do it. Woe to the one through whom it comes. It must happen, but woe to the one through whom it comes. If someone volunteers to do the wickedness, then not for their actions, but for their motives, they are judged. Now we need to be really careful with that. That may only apply to some specifically predetermined events. It may be that God has a master plan that starts with Adam and Eve eating the fruit and ends on the last day with Christ returning. This master plan, like the trunk of a tree, weaves its way through human history. And many events, it may happen in a different sense, but these master events that must happen so that the prophecies would be fulfilled, so that the atonement would be made, so that we would be saved, are all prearranged. And those who are involved in those prearranged plans are not held responsible for their actions, but rather for their motivations, if their motives in their actions are evil. On the other hand, it may be that it applies much more broadly. I think if you accept this idea of a key plan, a master plan, and the events in line of that master plan apply to this, if you take that and start working it out, you'll see that it's really impossible to decide where the master plan ends and where any event could be called irrelevant. For the tiniest little events in our lives often take on staggering importance when we see how they tie into the whole. At any rate, to those of us who are afflicted, God promises relief. He says, to those of you who are afflicted, relief. The King James word is rest. The idea is that we're there in that place, we're being judged because God has our good in mind. And if we can't understand it now, if we can't understand how the difficulties in our lives now contribute to our good someday, well, certainly someday we will. We don't understand what the relief will be. When we're suffering in any way, we can't possibly understand how God could make up for it. But we have his word that he will. And we must ask, is there any doubt that his idea of relief will not be more than enough? I mean, will God come up with something that he thinks is enough and we find it not compensation enough? You could ask another question. Will any Christian on that last day be heard saying, I really wish, now that it's all over, that I hadn't persevered so fervently? I really wish I hadn't been so faithful to God. I mean, when I see the payoff, I wish I had done less. Will any Christian say, I wish I was less concerned for his glory. I wish I devoted my life to other things. We know that Christians will be found saying the opposite. I wish I had more fervently persevered. I wish I'd been much, much more faithful to the God who repays for eternity those who suffer in the short time. I wish I'd been more concerned for his glory. That's what we'll hear people saying. And it gives a new significance to the verse in Revelation about God wiping away every tear. There'll be tears of remorse on some of our faces as we realize